All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to everybody who's joining us online as well. We tend to have a lot of people looking in increasingly at our live stream on the internet, so we'd like to welcome everybody who's joining us online, and thank you very much for another AGSIW panel. Today we're going to look at the strategic implications of Iraq's multiple crises, how a series of extremely dramatic seismic shocks have rocked Iraq's political system and society since last fall. Obviously, you've had the emergence of the street-level protests in the Shiite majority parts of Iraq, and especially in some of the large cities, including, but not only, Baghdad and Karbala and the other ones, Basra, etc. In addition to which, you've had the resignation of the government and the collapse of any semblance of a political consensus for administration inside Iraq, and no answer to that, whether convincing or unconvincing, until this date. A huge argument continuing over the question of the role of the Hashd al-Sha'bi PMF groups and the way in which they are to be incorporated or accommodated by the state. And that, again, is completely unresolved, as well as all the extremely legitimate socioeconomic and ultimately political demands of the demonstrators. And the fact that as their socioeconomic demands become more frustrated and more stymied, they inevitably become more political and have turned against not just the government, but also the militias and the militias' Iranian backers as well. So all of that, and then on top of that, you have the way in which Iraq has been dragged into the growing crisis between Iran and the United States. Iran's decision in late October to deploy the Kataib Hezbollah to fire missiles at American-related bases on what amounted to about a weekly basis. They and the person who were killed had the bad luck of an American contractor of Iraqi origin actually dying. The American response against Kataib Hezbollah's headquarters in Al-Qaim, which killed at least 24 Kataib Hezbollah cadres, the response being a besieging of the U.S. Embassy compound and the Green Zone in Baghdad. The response to that, apparently, being the killing of Qasim Soleimani and al-Muhandis and several other key Iranian and Iraqi figures, and then the Iranian retaliation and the standoff, which has put Iraq, obviously, in an incredibly difficult situation and placed the future of American forces and the American presence and role in Iraq into question. So stepping back from all of that, we have a series of questions which we have listed on this sheet that I'm not going to recite to you because I think they're obvious. What I'd like to do against that backdrop is ask our distinguished panel to help set the stage, and then we'll have a conversation among ourselves. But let me introduce them first. To my right is our distinguished president, Douglas Silliman. He joined us in the late spring, early summer this year. We're delighted to have him with us, and he came to us directly after a long term as U.S. ambassador to Iraq and a very distinguished diplomatic career in the Foreign Service of the United States before that. To my immediate right is Randa, who's a senior fellow and director of conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues at the Middle East Institute, and a very well-known commentator and a great sort of expert on all things Middle Eastern and Arab. And finally, to my far left, Ambassador Feisal al-Istrabadi, who is the former Iraqi ambassador to the UN and who is the founding director of the Center of the Study for the Middle East at Indiana University, Bloomington, and who has an extremely distinguished academic and diplomatic career in several countries, especially here in the United States, but also serving the Iraqi state as well. So a fantastic panel. And I'd just like to begin by getting each of them to give us an overview of where they think these multiple intersecting crises have left the Iraqi state and society and its interactions with the outside world, especially the United States, and of course the Gulf Arab countries. Right? Must be remembered that we always keep tacking back to them. And I'd like to begin with Ambassador Silliman to give us his perspective as inflected by U.S. government perspectives and his own experience as U.S. ambassador in Iraq for many years.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm actually very happy to be here today as a humble panelist and not sitting in the back of the room making sure all the electronics is working. This is really a treat for me to be able to speak at the Institute from the background of U.S. policy and my experience, having spent 5 of the past 10 years in Baghdad and traveling around Iraq. The one thing from my experience in Iraq which has been most disappointing throughout this period is the fact that many, if not most, and potentially all Iraqis to some degree see what the problems that Iraq is going through, certainly since 2003, as a product of Iranian-American rivalry and competition inside Iraq. I think that is not entirely true, but nonetheless, it is the frame through which a lot of Iraqis view the problems that they are undergoing. And I appreciate, Hussein, your recounting of recent history of the past several weeks. When recounting the history of Iraq, I don't know whether to go back weeks or millennia, because many of the same players and problems between sort of Persians and the Arabs of Mesopotamia and Kurds and other groups seem to be playing themselves out again. What is most striking, though, about the events starting on the 27th of December of last year, when an American contractor, military contractor, was killed at the K-1 base near Kirkuk, is that in the subsequent week and a half, the speed and the scale of escalation was unprecedented for this rivalry between the United States and Iran on Iraqi territory. Going back to 2003, when the United States pulled down Saddam Hussein and the structure that governed the country, it left open the country for a lot of the old rifts, whether religious, sectarian, ethnic, geographic, urban versus rural, to reassert themselves. And at the same time, you had a brilliant strategist and tactician, Qasem Soleimani, in Iran, who figured out how to take advantage of the holes in Iraqi society and governance and the security forces that were left after the United States toppled Saddam Hussein. So the period just after that, you saw the rise of al-Qaeda, Sunni extremism, and you saw at that point cooperation between Tehran and Washington, at least tacitly, as the United States stood up the Sahwa, the awakening Sunni groups that would push back against Sunni extremism in the West. At the same time that Soleimani and the Iranians were standing up parallel, mostly Shia militias in Baghdad in the south. When that was no longer in the interest of Iran and Shia politicians, and when al-Qaeda had been mostly pushed off to the margins, you saw the beginning of attacks on American forces by these Shia militias, and many of the groups like Kataib Hezbollah cut their teeth fighting American forces at the end of the surge up to 2011. In the intervening time, there was another push from Iran and a push, especially in the second term of Nouri al-Maliki as prime minister, to institutionalize and politicize the bureaucracy. The first Maliki term was relatively better governed than the second, but in the second one, he became under a lot of pressure from his party, from others, to put into the bureaucracy at senior and junior levels and mid-levels people who were beholden to political parties and political ideology, not necessarily the idea of Iraq as a watan, as a state or a nation. So the period when the United States withdrew its forces and before al-Qaeda morphed into ISIS and Daesh and came across the border again was consolidation of Shia groups, some of which are pro-Iranian, others of which were simply nationalist Shia, of the bureaucracy and the governance of large parts of Iraq. In 2014, the dramatic advance of Daesh, of ISIS, from Syria into Iraq, again heralded a period of relative passive or tacit cooperation between Iran and the United States, as we both fought this enemy to the stability of Iraq. There was relatively little direct coordination, although there was some, with the Popular Mobilization Forces and coalition forces. But generally, at the same period, Soleimani and the Iranians and the leadership of the Popular Mobilization Forces tried to institutionalize their forces more directly. And in 2016, the parliament passed a law incorporating the Popular Mobilization Forces formally into the security forces, giving the prime minister most of the power to decide how that would be done, and not defining it in law. And then after ISIS had been defeated, you saw the expansion of Shia militias, particularly the ones that had been born in the aftermath of the defeat of al-Qaeda 10 years earlier and had great sponsorship and Iranian training, moving into Anbar province, into Nineveh province, into Mosul, into areas where they had not had a significant amount of power in the past. And that sort of set the stage for what has happened in the past month, and I won't repeat what Hussein just said. Looking at this from an American standpoint, and in terms of the policy that I was asked to implement over the past 10 years, there were really three big policy areas that we were working on, and I think this is still the lens through which the American government tends to look at Iraq. The first one, and in some ways the easiest to address, is Sunni extremism and making sure that al-Qaeda, ISIS, Daesh, or some similar extremist organization does not again rise in Iraq. And the main way to do that has been to institutionalize and professionalize the Iraqi security services that remain loyal to the elected government in Baghdad. The second issue is the larger issue of the United States and Iran, where the United States wants to make sure that Iraq can act independently of Iran, hopefully in concert with the United States, but at least be neutral in the region and be a source of regional stability. A way that we have tried to do this is, again, through institution building, through military and civilian institutions, and that has become one of the few ways now that the United States or the West may be able to help Iraq extract itself from the grip of the Quds Force and those Iranians who would like to see Iraq as Iran's strategic depth, politically, economically, and in terms of security. But in my mind, the third issue is the most important, and that's the Iraqi economy. As I told Iraqis every time I got in the media, every time I met them, Iraq is a wealthy country. Iraq has oil, it has gas, it has water, it has arable land, it has irrigation systems, it has an educated population and a history of appreciation of education and professionalism that goes back a very, very long time. The problem is that these resources have been serially mismanaged and politicized. You can make arguments about which particular modern history, part of modern history of Iraq, in which these were most badly manipulated. But I would say certainly from 2010 to right now, they have been badly used, and personal gain, party gain, and in a broader sense, Iranian strategic gain has been a main goal. We have been looking, this is an area where the United States is actually not alone in what we have been doing. We have worked with most of the major countries in the world, obviously our European allies, the European Union, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, our partners in Asia, to try to find ways to help reform and develop the Iraqi economy. But one of the things that we have been unable to do, and this is one of the questions I'm actually interested in hearing from Randa or from Feisal about, is no one has yet been able to change the way that Iraqis think about the economy, where young Iraqis who are protesting want better government delivery of services. A lot of them seem to also want a government job, a sinecure. They do not necessarily want to see a liberalized economy plugged into the world that provides economic opportunities for business and entrepreneurship. And by the end of 2022, 2023, 1 million new Iraqis coming onto the job market every year, this is the fundamental issue that is going to make a difficult political and security situation even more difficult to deal with in the future.
Great. What an excellent start. So let's bring in Randa. with more or less the same question, but if you can talk a little bit about all of these issues, looking at the protest movement in particular and the kind of street-level aspirations that we've been seeing playing out in recent months.
First, thank you very much, Hussein and Doug and the rest of the staff at the Ergal State Institute for the invitation. It's really an honor for me to be on this panel. I think looking at the protest, I think we need to put this in context. This is not, I mean, movements have been going on in Iraq at least since 2004, 5, and even before that, of course, but recent times. And so the difference between this protest and the previous waves of protests, like if we look at this protest movement versus, for example, the 2012, 2013 protest movement, there the demand was focused on reforming the justice system, on the sahwa salaries, but they were targeting at the time the Prime Minister al-Maliki. He was the focus of the anger. He was the problem, and you know, that was the target. If we look at the protests in 2015, in 2015, 2016, the different kind also of element in it is that, unlike this time, the protest was eventually manipulated and co-opted by the Sadrists. So what's new and different about this protest is that it's not about the prime minister per se, it's about the whole system. It's about the rules of the game that were put in place after 2003. And that's when they said, the slogan is Nurid Watan. We need a homeland, we need a country, we need new rules of the game for this country, which we feel as Iraqis, we have a role to play in it. So and unlike 2015, 2016, despite attempts by the different Iraqi political leaders, this movement has been pretty good at standing against any attempts at penetration, co-optation by the traditional leaders, whether it's the Sadrist or, you know, other of the political leaders. And so, and hence, its platform has been, as I said, about changing the rules of the game, changing the whole political system. And that's why it has been seen as, and they should interpret as such, as an existential threat by the political class that is in Iraq. I mean, this is a movement that's not saying we want to negotiate with you, you know, with you staying in power. We want you out of the game. We don't want you in the negotiations anymore. Now, what has been their demand? First, let me say about the profile. I mean, the profile, mostly it is unemployed, underemployed, the great majority Shia. When you speak with some of the protesters, I think the major drive for them or the incentive for them has been the Basra protest more than, you know, the protest before that. I think the violence used in the Basra protest made a large segment of the Iraqi Shia community realize that this system is beyond salvageable. That because until then, you know, the Shia looked at the system as l'état c'est moi, you know. So they were reluctant basically to go against the system because, you know, what they're going to change it with, it is them. However, I think the violence done by security forces, Shia in Shia majority area, forced a reckoning inside the young Shia religiously observant community that this system, though it is a majority Shia, it really is not there to protect our interest, and hence we need to change the whole system. And hence the reaction from the regime, from the ruling class, has been disproportionately violent. You know, the kind of, and the idea is that we need to nip it in the bud, and they have failed at doing that. And I think that's the lesson also taken by the Iraqis, also by the Iranians, from the Syria movement, from what happened in Syria, that Bashar al-Assad failed to nip Syria in the bud, and look what he has ended up with, years and years of violence and protest. And we are not going to do that. I think that's one of the lessons, and that's why this disproportionate violence early on in reaction to these protests, when they were really not that large in number. In fact, the violence and the way it was used and the levels of violence, in fact, caused more people to join the protest movement and backfired on the government. So where are we today? I think today, especially post-Soleimani, there was an attempt for some time at changing the narrative that the protest street was trying to put forward by basically accusing them of being foreign agent, responsive to foreign agendas, and that did not go well, did not work. I think the Soleimani kill has presented an opportunity for the government, but also specifically for the PMU, members of the government that are linked to Iran, an opportunity to change this narrative. And hence we have seen this call by Sadr along with the PMUs for this million-person march next Friday. And the thinking behind it is as follows within that camp. One is they would like, through that march, especially if it is going to be in the numbers that they have been preparing to bring to the street, is to show basically the leadership and to show the world that there is a street that wants the U.S. forces out. There is a large street that, and in doing so, put pressure on people like Barham Saleh, put pressure on members of the parliament who did not show up for the vote on January 5 to basically, come around and agree to the demand or agree to this to the demand of that camp to expel U.S. forces. That's one tactic. The second tactic of that camp is and so how will the protesters, or how are the protesters planning to react? Again, in conversation with some of the protesters, I think you have a split in their ranks about how they're going to react to this January 24 march. First, there is a high level of fear of violence, that there will be some violent confrontation that will be unavoidable, and that will, in terms of physical security, but also in terms of the impact on the societal support of the protest movement. So you have groups that says, as a result, we are not going to participate in this march. We're going to stay out of it. Another group is saying, no, we are going to participate in this march, and we're going there and we're going to shout no to Iran and no to US. So the million-person march is going there to say no to Iran and no to US out. The protesters from Tahrir, who are part of the original protest movement, at least those who are going to participate in the January 24, are saying we're going to participate and we are going to shout both against Iran and against the US. I think January 24 is going to be an important divide, not divide, but an important point in the future of this protest movement, which is tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow, right? Tomorrow. Yes. You're right, Friday. Yes. And so, and how it evolves. Definitely, I think what Sadr and the PMUs who met with him in Qom last week, what they want to do is basically, take ownership of the street again, and by doing so change totally the narrative and then put more pressure to, push for expelling U.S. forces out. Whether they will succeed or not, we don't know. We'll see. But I'm afraid that there will be violence. There have been calls now by some civil society leaders on Sadr to call it off tomorrow. I think, of course, it's too late to do that. He's not going to do that. But the idea within, again, that camp, the Sadr PMF camp, that this is the first, the first attempt to expel the U.S. and to change the narrative about the protest was the vote on January 25, which is a political, tactic. The second attempt is this march to put pressure. And the third, as I said, when they asked for, or they called for reactivation of the resistance front in their statement in Qom, is to resort to violent tactics to put pressure on the Americans to leave. So the question going forward, will the protests be able to continue offering this platform of a technocratic government, changing the political system, creating political space for participation participation for people like them, I don't know. It will depend on what happens tomorrow in the march.
Great.
I'll stop here.
So, Feisal, if we can build off of those two and also get your take on the overall situation as it is, especially with an eye to the challenges facing the government and the administrative state and apparatus inside Iraq.
Well, thank you very much, Hussein. It's a privilege to be here on this panel with such three distinguished colleagues. I do want to begin by saying this is the first time I've spoken in this city since my mentor died, Dr. Adnan Pachachi. And so I want to start there because, in my view, the protesters, what I call, and we have to distinguish between what I could call the real protesters. I call them the Tahrir protesters, which is a bit of a misnomer because they're not just in Baghdad. They're throughout the cities of the south, including, as Hussein said, Karbala and Najaf, Nasriya, which is sort of the hometown of the current prime minister, Basra, etc. The protesters, the Tahrir protesters, may not know it, but the Iraq they are demonstrating for is in fact is Pachachi's vision for Iraq, which he articulated beginning in 2003, an Iraq in which the individual's relationship with the state is based on citizenship and not on ethno-confessional identity. In his last interview before becoming ill, his last illness, he called for protests. And he called for protests for this sort of an Iraq, for a protest against corruption, and said this political class, and he always identified himself with it. He always used to say, this political class, and I am one of them, is incapable of governing. It needs a new political class. It needs a new system. I thought it appropriate to take a few minutes of my time to make that point. But I agree with my colleagues that there has been a seismic shift in Iraqi politics since October of last year. Where it's going to end up, I don't know. As Randa expertly laid out, it could end very badly for the protesters. And I suppose if you were forced to make a bet, you might bet that it will end badly for the protesters, although obviously one hopes very much not. Finding stability in sort of 2020 in Iraq, I think, has become much, much harder in light of the Soleimani killing. And not just because it is Soleimani, but remember that in Soleimani's car, when the convoy was attacked, was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who, in any event, is an Iraqi national and a senior was a senior Iraqi security official. Now, both of those men had amongst others, the blood of many Iraqis on their hands. So I don't want to be misunderstood. I am singing no elegies for the dearly departed. But I'm trying to deal with the political ramifications of what I regard as a reckless act. If there was an imperative for the United States to kill Qasem Soleimani, that's the business of the United States. It should not have been done in Iraq. Because it has thrust Iraq front and center into what had been a sort of a side battle going on in Iraq between Iran and the United States through proxies, it has now become front and center the battleground. And that is not a happy position for Iraq to be in. I quote the putative African saying that when the elephants fight, it is the grass that is destroyed. Iraq is the grass between, in any event. I don't mean to suggest that the United States and Iran stand in equipoise in terms of power. They obviously don't, but nonetheless, they're two far more powerful states, more powerful than Iraq. Now, stability becomes harder when the prize for Iraq becomes so obviously front and center in the battle between in what could have been and may yet become a hot war of sorts, asymmetric albeit, between the United States and Iran. Now, a colleague, I guess for a time, she's now in government, Denise Natali, who I think is an Assistant Secretary of State now, but we were on a panel together somewhere here in this city some couple of years ago before she went into government. And she pointed out that Iran's ideal state in Iraq is Nouri Maliki's Iraq in 2013. Not stable, but not the utter chaos of 2014 with ISIL knocking on the door of Iran. The problem, of course, as Denise herself said, is that you cannot sustain Nouri Maliki's Iraq. Nouri Maliki's Iraq of 2013 is so inherently unstable that it will descend into 2014, and that's a state of chaos too far for Iran. But certainly Iran does not want a stable Iraq. And the sort of the imperative now for Iran to bring the American project in Iraq to failure has become, I think, a greater imperative now for Iran than it was before the killing of Soleimani and Muhandis. Others have talked about the fact, I think Douglas talked about the fact that there has been some cooperation, whether actual or in effect, between the United States and Iran, say in the fight against ISIL and all of that. I won't repeat any of that. From an Iraqi perspective, to limit the ability of Iran to promote instability in Iraq, it would have had to have delivered a much harder blow to Iran than it did. I'm not advocating for that, by the way. I don't see a United States interest in taking Iran on directly. And in fact, I think it's President Trump's instinct not to do so. I think he demonstrated that at one point when he called back a military strike against Iran. I even think that countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states who had been advocating a direct confrontation between between the U.S. and Iran, had their minds focused wonderfully, to paraphrase Dr. Johnson, when they actually saw the possibility of such a confrontation in light of the Soleimani assassination. So assuming that Iran chooses not to sort of raise the ante to an intolerable degree for the United States, it I think, has an incentive to fly under the radar and simply to make the kind of trouble in Iraq that we've been seeing. A parliamentary vote which, as the Speaker of Parliament said, was essentially a Shi'i, I would correct him and say, the pro-Iranian Shi'i members of Parliament's decision that the United States forces should leave. The Kurdish parties and all of them, not just the, there are some less powerful Kurdish coalitions in the Iraqi parliament. They too were not in Parliament. It wasn't just the two main parties that are well known. Sunnis, by and large, boycotted. So it was, and other Shia as well, who are not a part of this coalition, were not there. Be that all as it may, the stakes are very high for Iran, and I'm sorry to focus on Iran when I should be talking about Iraq, but it is a major player, as is the United States. But the actions of the United States have made the stakes much higher for Iran. Now, the protesters had been largely anti-Iranian. They had been chanting Iran barra barra, Iran out out. The sort of recklessness, in my view, of U.S. policy in Iraq has sort of made them realize that, there is unfortunately, a malign role that the U.S. is prepared to play in Iraq, which is to say, if it really wants to take Iran on in Iraq, you could leave a scorched earth in Iraq, and Iraqis want no part of that, of whatever ilk they may be.
Yeah.
And so now, as Randa has pointed out, you actually do have some of the Tahrir protesters, which I distinguish between them and the sort of supporters of the pro-Iranian militias who are the ones who attacked the embassy in Baghdad. So now that some of the Tahrir protesters are saying Iran out, the U.S. out. Well, for those of us who would like to see closer connections with the United States, between Iraq and the United States, this has made that job that much harder. So what's left for the Iraqi political class? Here, let me begin by saying that I actually think there's a potentially interesting dynamic in which, in light of the, I think it was a 2018 or 17 now? I'm sorry, I'm getting confused with the dates, and I don't have it in my notes. That the Kurdistan region of Iraq held an independence. 2017. Thank you. September 2017.
Right at the
Thank
very
you.
end of it.
Since that time, there has been, I think, a relative marginalization of the Kurdish power in Baghdad. Right. I actually think this is a moment when the Kurds, and I know that the Kurds of Iraq, just like the rest of Iraq, are not of one stripe, but allow me to use that term regardless. Yeah. When the Kurds of Iraq actually can find a new role to play in Baghdad, I think it's fair to say that at least the Kurdish leadership does not want the exit of the United States from Iraq.
No doubt.
And obviously the president of the Kurdistan region, or the regional president of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, met with President Trump in Davos, as did the president of Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think this is an opportunity for new coalitions, and I know we say this every few years. I'm very well aware of that. But there's actually an opportunity for new coalitions to form in Iraq that cross ethnic and sectarian bounds, and that can promote a unified vision for a way forward based on political interest, which is the position one wants Iraq to be in, and I would say is what the Tahrir protesters are asking for. Now, whether that comes to pass or not, I don't know, but the opportunity is there, I think. There's a new electoral law. I don't think it'll make any difference. The political parties in Baghdad will adapt as they have. We've had, I think, 3 different electoral systems that I can think of as I sit here, maybe 4, but 3 anyway. And in each case, we have not only elected the same parties, but by and large the same personalities, because the political parties adapt to the new sort of environment. And by the way, the best at it have been the Sadrists,
of course,
whose electoral system, their own sort of internal system, is extremely sophisticated. Don't judge a person by his or her headdress. The protesters are calling for a technocratic government, and they were told they had one. The problem is, and this may be similar in Lebanon or not, I don't know
All
enough about
extremely
Lebanon to know.
Very similar.
But
It's
the-
all extremely similar.
Well, the problem is, it's fine. So you have, Lu'ay Khatib is the Minister of Electricity, a technocrat's technocrat. But the ministries are not manned by technocrats.
Right,
The
So
bureaucrats.
I would
exactly.
rather have politicians
Exactly.
at the top and technocrats at the bottom
Yes.
than what I have now, which is the reverse.
Right.
Same way in Lebanon?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's not
No,
going
we
to...
have it at both ways. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's been that way in
Yeah,
Iraq.
no-
but
no
now
technocrats at all.
that's not going to change, which means that the delivery of services isn't going to change.
Yes.
No, it's not.
Yes. Yes.
I know I'm running out of time.
Well, we're going to talk more about
All right,
these
so
different
let
issues.
me stop there, and
Yeah.
then we can
All right.
get
Well,
into the
Randa
conversation.
had
Thank you.
Quickly,
a response.
Quick
Yeah.
comments, yes.
No, go ahead.
On your points about Iran, barra. I think we need to qualify that is that this is not about the US and about Iran. And I'm talking about this
Yeah.
pre-Soleimani kill. It's about they are protesting against Iran's dominant role in Iraq, and they see Iran as complicit
Right.
in a system that has robbed the country's resources, marginalized them, and killed them. That's where the Iran barra. It's
Right.
it's not a vote for US against Iran. It's a
I
vote.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one. The second point, since Soleimani kill, I think it has become politically difficult for them. Just the optics
Yeah.
of saying only Iran barra. You have to say US barra and Iran barra since the Soleimani kill, because they don't want to put themselves
Yeah.
on the side of the US against Iran since Soleimani kill, because of the optics in the whole country.
Yeah.
And that shows some strategic, acumen. That's some,
Strategery, as a,
well, some political maturity.
Yeah.
So that's two. The third point I want to make about the election law. Shortly after it was, passed by Parliament last December, there was a big banner in Tahrir Square saying the election law does not represent us. And the election law, okay, there is a change about how, they moved from list to people, to one person per district. But it's totally silent on how districts are going to be designed, electoral district, who's going to, who are the voters in each electoral district, and especially that there has not been a census in Iraq since, for the last...
1957.
1957. So basically, it can be designed, once it comes to implementation of the election law, it can be designed in a way to allow, the kind of dominance again of the same traditional political party. And then correct me. Even if you are elected per district, member per district, once you get into the parliament, you have to form a political party to come together and nominate a prime minister according to the constitution. Is that correct? Yep. So we are back to the old politics again. And so the protesters so into it, so that this new election law is really not that new, and it really does not provide the venue and the mechanisms that enable the non-traditional voices, civil society people, people who are not corrupt, to enter the political system.
Let's go back to Doug for a second. So, the Gulf Arab states looking at all of this would ask a whole series of questions. Among them, what's the future of the American role and the American military and other forms of presence in Iraq?
For one, I am not as pessimistic on the ability or willingness of the Iraqi government to kick out American or coalition or NATO forces as a lot of people are. I have a great deal of confidence, especially over the past 10 years, in the ability of Iraqi politicians, when given the opportunity to do nothing, to do nothing.
Right.
And I say that only partially in jest, because, for example, the agreement that has U.S. forces in the country is a 2014 exchange of diplomatic notes between the Department of State and the Iraqi Foreign Ministry, which has no end date, but it does have a one-year escape clause. So when one of the two parties formally requests the other to break the agreement, there is then 1 year before that needs to be accomplished. So if you're going from a legal standpoint, that provides a little bit of breathing room. Second, and as I think Feisal pointed out, Nearly half of the parliament boycotted the session in which the parliament asked the caretaker prime minister to abrogate the agreement that kept coalition forces in the country. Coalition forces are in the country based on 17 different individual diplomatic notes, and there's a separate diplomatic note and process for the separate NATO training mission. The mere negotiation of this may not even be possible if Adel Abdul Mahdi believes that as a caretaker prime minister, he does not have the authority to abrogate an agreement that was entered into by his predecessor, al-Istrabadi, when he was a full prime minister. So there are a lot of legal loopholes that this could slip through and delay a discussion of how this might happen. Now, that does not mean that sort of Shia militias are not going to fire rockets at the green zone of the American embassy. It does not mean that there will not be other potentially violent pressure on U.S. or coalition forces to push them out. And the question is going to be, what will Washington's reaction be? And frankly, what will the reaction be of NATO in Brussels and the 16 other national governments that have forces in Iraq right now under the counter-Daesh coalition? The Iranian ballistic missiles shot at Ain al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province were a strategic message aimed at the Americans. The ballistic missiles shot but not hitting Erbil was a message to both Iraqi Kurds, but also the entire 17-member coalition, because I believe every single member of the coalition has forces at the Erbil, at the military side of the Erbil Air Base. So the question is going to be, how will European governments and partner governments in the fight against ISIS and the fight to strengthen and institutionalize the Iraqi security forces react? What will the reaction of the Bundestag be, parliaments in other parts of Europe? So I can see a weakening of the, up to this point, fairly strong ties within NATO and within this NATO-like partnership. But I think that Iraq's own inability to implement its laws in a timely manner, in a clear manner, is probably going to push this conversation through 2020, likely into 2021, unless there is a significant development such as the legitimate selection of a very anti-American prime minister with a parliamentary majority that can back him in this. And again, there are too many legal questions that this could be sort of pushed through the sieve of Iraqi politics and delayed. So I think that's what's going to happen.
In
fact,
fact, building on what you just said, I mean, Adel Abdul Mahdi has already said that it's up to the next government to, finalize this issue of, removing U.S. implementing the non-binding resolution of the COR. And so he has already tried to, distance himself away from this issue. And I think that's why you have this pressure now coming from Iran through this axis, you know, with Sadr and the PMU, the pro-Iran linked PMU, to put pressure on Adel Abdul Mahdi, to put pressure on other Shia, to make it, in a way, to constrain their options, and make it almost politically impossible for them not to join this movement of or this call of expelling U.S. forces. But I agree with you. I think there is more bargaining ahead of us, and the Iranians know exactly that. And it's going to be interesting also to see, how Sadr will react in the future. I mean, after all, okay, Sadr is an Islamist, Sadr is a nationalist, Sadr is a populist, but also Sadr, when the Khazali of the world were calling for expelling Barham Saleh from Iraq if he were to meet with Trump, come up with a statement saying, no, we have to, he is to be respected. So Sadr, I think the person or the leader to watch more, and he's seeing, and I would like to hear the opinion of my colleagues, because he's seeing an opportunity for him, especially after the death of al-Muhandis, to come in and take control of that whole movement, the Sadrist plus the PMU. And we have heard a lot of the turmoil that's taking place inside the ranks of the PMU, especially the Iran-linked PMU, since al-Muhandis. I think Soleimani's kill was a major setback for Iran and Iran's regional project, but al-Muhandis kill was a major setback for the PMU project in Iraq.
It's really
much
underrated,
much more. He was the brain, he was the soul, he was the strategist.
Much
he
harder
was,
to replace
He was the
him.
enforcer. It's extremely hard to enforce him. And that's why we are hearing now these reports of Nasrallah being brought in by Hezbollah to help them, help them with this process. And so Sadr is seeing also that, and he's going to try to position himself in that role. So Sadr is the person to watch going forward.
Which is not necessarily ideal from an Iranian point of view. You had a...
Exactly.
Well, just to comment on what Randa just said, Sadr has always had, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, he has always had a nationalist rhetoric.
Always.
Yeah.
Always, from 2003.
Yes.
So he can very easily at least try to get out, as the expression goes, to get out in front of this parade.
Yes.
Right.
Whether he's successful or not remains to be seen. By the way, I don't quite, if I may, I don't quite agree with you that what the Parliament did is non-binding. I don't know why it would
It's
be
not
non-binding.
self-enforcing, though. How about non-self-enforcing?
Well, it's binding on the government.
Yeah, but it's not self-enforcing. Somebody has to do it.
That's right.
So that's the difference.
It is constitutionally binding on the government.
On the government.
Then it's time to be corrected because you are the constitutional expert.
But it's still not self-enforcing, which is
it's not.
Crucial distinction, I
what
think.
it required of the government is to come up with a timetable for the removal of U.S. forces, all foreign forces.
All foreign.
In Iraq. And Adel Abdul Mahdi, of course, has already informed the American ambassador in Baghdad that American forces need to get out. And here, by the way, just as a footnote, the president's comments about that are not only unhelpful, they're insulting.
Oh, yes, they are. Yes.
And by the way, Feisal Khazali has quoted them in his recent video in support of the so-called million-person march. We'll see. But anyway, so I just want to make those 2 points.
What about there was this argument about whether a caretaker government, has constitutionally the authority to implement this resolution, which is, as you said, non-binding. Can a taker, is it legally, according to the Constitution?
Remember, the Parliament's not caretaker, right? It's the elected Parliament.
I'm saying the government.
I know.
The
but it's the Parliament which has instructed the government. You can modify it any way you want to, whatever adjective you want to use. It's the government.
Yes.
And an elected Parliament has apparently had a quorum, although that was being challenged at one point. But if it didn't have a quorum, then obviously it's not even a resolution.
Right.
But if it had a quorum, which is over 50%, I think you have to, I can't remember now, you have to have 2 or 3 over 50%, something like that, to have a quorum. If it had a quorum, then certainly an elected Parliament has the ability to instruct the government to undertake these acts. And I would say that as a rule of law matter, not as a policy matter, but as a rule of law matter, as a constitutional matter, the government has a mandate and must carry out the instructions of Parliament, unless there's some argument that Parliament has exceeded its prerogatives, which I don't see here.
No, but even a caretaker cabinet has to.
Yeah, because the members of Parliament know it's a caretaker cabinet. The reason it's a caretaker cabinet is because Parliament said so.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they know that, and yet they have instructed it to act.
They've instructed it to act, but they've left a lot of space open as to how it could be implemented. So that gives everybody the ability for what a lot of people in Iraq seem to want to do, which is to say wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment without actually carrying it out. Because in addition to getting rid of all foreign forces, you get rid of a lot of foreign money, a lot of needed support. And so that brings us back to the flip side, which I'd like to ask you, the flip side of what I asked Doug, and we'll bring in the audience very soon. But what about the future, and I ask both of you, of the Hashd al-Sha'bi groups and post al-Muhandis, and in this current situation, What does this do to the program of incorporating them into the official structures of the state, security structures and other structures? And what does it say about, what does all that imply about the Iranian role in Iraq into the sort of medium term? Any thoughts about it? I'm not asking you to be Nostradamus, but...
Well, then I can be, sort of opaque.
Yes, you can be opaque. Yeah. You can be as opaque as the Iraqi parliament.
Yeah. Look, of course, the notion that the Iraqi popular mobilization units have been incorporated into the Iraqi state security apparatus has always been a fiction.
Yeah.
It's a legal fiction.
Right.
They were brought in wholesale with their command structures intact. Mm-hmm. They do not report through the legal chain of command. They report directly, ostensibly, to the prime minister. But we had the example post Kurdistan region of Iraq referendum in 2017 when Haider Abadi issued an order and Hadi al-Amri told Haider Abadi where he could go.
Yes,
so
exactly.
we've had that example. So the question now is, are they weak enough without al-Muhandis there that you could actually incorporate them into the state security apparatus?
That's the question.
That is to say, not just bring them in wholesale as units, but actually disperse them into the existing Iraqi state security
and
apparatus.
break them up and all of that. Yeah.
I don't. If I were to play Nostradamus, except be a clear Nostradamus, not an opaque one, I would say I would not bet on it.
Right.
Yes.
The Muhandis may be gone, but Qais Khazali, Hadi al-Amri, and the boys, and they are boys, that's not a sexist remark, are still there and have a real incentive. Yes, and they're still a force to be reckoned with the support of Iran.
Right, exactly. Randa, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I think, Soleimani exercised tight control over the PMU.
Right.
I mean, unlike Hezbollah, where Iran and Soleimani have always basically let them operate. They only had two red lines or two files that Iran always expected from Hezbollah to get to be consulted about.
Right.
One is war and peace issues, and the second is any future dialogue with the United States on this, or any U.S. representative. At some point, I'm not going to name, a former U.S. president wanted to meet with Nasrallah, and basically Nasrallah said no. And so partly because he did not get the okay from Khamenei to do that, or he did not have the time to get okay from Khamenei to do that. So in the PMU, you have to, if we think about an Iranian franchise, the regional project as an Iranian franchise system, we think about Hezbollah as the first franchisee, the most successful, and then we think of the PMU as like the second-tier franchisee, where it needs a lot of training.
It's a great analogy.
It's a lot of training, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of control, a lot of command, because it is unreliable. It has too many uncontrollable elements, too many political entrepreneurs.
Not vertically integrated.
Exactly, and Soleimani has put the structure of really tight control over them. I think with him through al-Muhandis, and al-Muhandis helped enforce that.
Right.
I think with both of them gone at the same time, that's going to create room for a lot of competition within this group of who's going, along with Sadr, of who's going to step in al-Muhandis' shoes, who's going to take the leadership. And it might also create splits within the group, some in fact becoming even more violent than they already are, and we have seen that happen in other instances. And so I think that whole network is going to be interesting to watch how they evolve, how they develop. And as I said earlier, it's clear that Nasrallah has been asked to step in, and partly because Hezbollah has, since 2005, has had an extensive network in Iraq. and has kept it. And through that network, they have lots of influence and lots of reach. And so they are already on the ground positioned to play that role when called upon. And I think they will be playing more of a role. And that's why when it comes to Lebanon, the priority now for Nasrallah is Iraq and less Lebanon.
Right. Absolutely. I'm going to ask Doug to give us his views on these matters and the future of the Hashd and Iran's influence, and then I'm going to bring in the audience and let you guys come into the conversations, please.
Yeah, and I'll be very quick. I actually agree with what Feisal said. As much as the weakening of the leadership structure of the Hashd al-Shabi may provide opportunities to pull some of the forces into the formal security structure, it's not going to happen with those that are most pro-Iranian, and I think that the impact will be relatively insignificant. What concerns me, though, is the political pressure on Iraqi Shia politicians to reduce the budget and the recruiting for the mainline Iraqi security forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and especially the counterterrorism service. As a limited defense budget is carved up and a greater share is given to the PMF, and a lesser share is being given to the CTS, particularly in recruiting for the past year, you can see a plan to recreate in Iraq an Iran-like security structure with the Sepah, with the Revolutionary Guards, the primary force, and the Army and the Navy supporting forces, maybe to push back against a land invasion, but not the one that protects the state.
Right.
In the same way, but interestingly, in 2018, about the time of the demonstrations in the south of Iraq, especially Basra, there was an attempt to actually create volunteers to help the militias that they actually tried to call the Basij, which failed miserably. So it was partially because of the anger of the Basrawis at that time, but I think it is more, I think what Randa talked about, the idea that even religious Shia, especially young Shia in the south, see Iran as the dominant force in the militias that run their neighborhoods and govern, and the overarching economic force in southern Iraq. There is a desire not to see that control extended in Iran-like structure. So, yes, good news and bad news, sort of, but my concern is the slow atrophy of the mainline Iraqi security forces that are beholden or take the orders from the elected government.
Okay. All right, well, let's bring in the audience. And boy, we have a lot of interest here. So why don't we begin towards the front and work our way back? And we'll begin with you, madam, right here, of course.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Marina Ottaway with the Wilson Center.
If it's directed to any specific panelist, tell us. If not.
No, it's really directed to all of you. First of all, I have a very brief comment. A lot of the things you were discussing at the end about the likelihood that the government will implement the decision of Parliament. Let's wait to see what happens tomorrow, because I think at that point we might have a much clearer issue. My question is really about what are the Gulf states doing in this, particularly the whole issue of trying to carve out a Sunni state of some sorts. I hear a lot of rumors, and I'm not sure what's going on. So if you could address that issue, I think.
I mean, I can at least say they've definitely been interested in replicating the KRG model in some kind of way in Western Iraq, and thereby creating, in effect, a loosely integrated Iraqi confederation, which would retain Iraq's nominal territorial integrity in the Iraqi state. It doesn't break up Iraq into pieces, but weakens the grip of certain factions and particularly weakens Iran's dominance of the country. And that was a goal. Whether there's any opportunity to do that or not, I leave it to the panelists. Anybody want to address that?
Yeah, I would.
Please.
I found, especially in government formation in 2018, significant differences in the attitudes of different Gulf governments toward what was going on in Iraq, with Qatar being the biggest outlier, but with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia interested in a stronger position for Sunni politicians that they liked and knew well, Kuwait focusing on economic assistance, particularly in the south of the country, looking at their near neighborhood. And there really was no unified GCC political or economic position inside Iraq. Right. And frankly, I think this is a problem. It would be much more useful if the GCC could strategize amongst themselves and figure out how they might best be able to strengthen the independence of a government in Baghdad from Tehran, certainly, but from other factions. I mean, there are many who are worried about what they fear will be increasing influence from Turkey, especially if there is Qatari support in that area. So the answer is, I didn't see a unified Gulf approach, and I would have liked to have seen more Gulf engagement in economic development more than on the political side, because that's where the dollars and the time might be more well spent.
It's probably where there's more of an opportunity to make a positive impact. In other words, to present yourself as part of the solution to these socioeconomic grievances probably wins you points in the long run. I think the UAE was keenest on the idea of a second KRG because it's their model.
Yes.
You know, a loose confederation is exactly. I think it's their model for all these troubled areas because it sort of replicates their own in a way. You know, and so they're keenest. And then some of the others are less keen for their own reasons. They don't want anything to do with that. Yes, please.
What Iraq needs is less interference from its neighbors, not more.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm always reminded of what Barham Saleh said at the time. I think he was deputy prime minister at Davos, in fact, that it was a shame that Iraq was not a Pacific island nation because then it wouldn't have any neighbors.
The Lebanese say the same.
Yeah, I'm sure. So if
Israel made itself a Pacific island.
if the Gulf states think that Iran has a dominant role now in Iraq, wait until you weaken Baghdad even further.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's the point of some of the other
But
states.
also, I think to be able to get this KRG, you need to have a united Sunni front that
which
leads
you don't
into
have,
this project.
right.
And you don't have that.
No.
I mean, you have some of the Sunnis that are part of the pro-Iran axis right,
Right.
now. And they need to be incentivized a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's going to be
This
the
is
case.
sort of what I was hinting at.
Yeah.
It's a pipe dream at the moment. Okay, let's go to you, and then we'll move in the back and the sides. And I'm sorry there's so many people, but go right ahead.
I hate to ask a question related to Iran, but
Go ahead.
while I completely acknowledge what Ambassador Feisal said, that the targeted killing of Soleimani on Iraqi soil thrusts Iraq front and center into this Iran-U.S. confrontation, a few weeks ago, probably 2 months ago, at this very institute, you hosted a panel that looked at where was the maximum pressure U.S. campaign headed to.
Yes, we did.
I think one of your panelists, Dina Sfandiari, who's seen as an expert on Iranian issues, had voiced the opinion that the Iranian regime was going to continue to push the United States until it found out where the limits were.
I did too.
And so we saw the escalations that you so clearly outlined at the beginning of this session today. You know, the killing of the American citizen, the downing of the drone, and scaling of the perimeter at the embassy in Baghdad that was chillingly reminiscent of Tehran
They found
in
their limits,
1979.
yes.
And so
they found it.
they found their limits.
And they got the crisis,
and it seems
just not
to
the
be-
one they wanted.
Right, but it seems to be the dominant view in this town that the United States took it too far with this targeted killing of Soleimani. So my question is, which is going to be a hard one to tackle, I think,
Well,
for Ambassador Silliman, please.
Okay.
What is, in your opinion, an alternate course of action that the United States should have taken to show Iran where the limit is and to force it to a negotiating table for round 2 of the JCPOA?
Okay,
Yeah.
do you want to second guess this?
I'm not going to second guess the administration's decision, but I might try to figure out why they did what they did.
Okay.
First of all, as Hussein pointed out, essentially from the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA and the imposition of maximum pressure in the middle of 2018, Iran has been trying to find ways to get out from under the economic pressure of the United States, first by going to Europe and Asian allies to try to find some sort of a mechanism to continue some sort of trade or limited oil supplies. When that didn't work, they began unilaterally removing the restrictions that were placed inside the JCPOA. And they also, in the middle of 2019, began these small pinprick but deniable actions, limpet mines on tankers in the Arabian Sea.
But above the waterline.
Above the waterline. I mean, Houthi attacks on Abha Airport 2 times, desalinization plants, the downing of, the ramp, but escalating.
Yes.
Because they were looking to find out what would it require for America's Arab Gulf allies or Asian allies to pressure the United States to a
ease
point where they
sanctions,
would ease sanctions, permit some sort of
That's it.
trade or oil sales, or get back into negotiations. And they thought that if we attack Khurais and Abqaiq, the United States, look at the Carter Doctrine, has to respond in some way, and then we can work from there. When there was no American response in early September after Khurais and Abqaiq, after they had about 3 weeks to judge the results, then you saw on the 28th of October the beginning of a series, as Hussein put out, rocket attacks toward the embassy in Baghdad, Iraqi military bases that housed coalition personnel. On the 8th of December, there was an attack on a counterterrorism service training base near Baghdad airport in which 6 CTS soldiers were killed, but no American or coalition forces. The attack on the 27th of December was qualitatively and quantitatively different. It was a barrage of 31 missiles that was intended to violate the stated administration's line that an American casualty at the hands of Iran or an Iranian proxy was the red line, and that Iran would be held responsible. That has been the line from President Trump, from Secretary of State Pompeo, going back a long time. I believe that was a conscious attempt on the part of Tehran to break that red line, to see what the American reaction would be, because there had been virtually no reaction to anything that they had done before that. They probably should have taken President Trump and Secretary Pompeo at their word that an American casualty was in fact the red line, because they got a very interesting set of strikes on 5 different Kataib Hezbollah bases in Iraq and Syria that were storage and facilitation logistics units between Tehran and Beirut. I do not know at which point in this the decision was made to go after Soleimani, but it was clear that once the red line had been crossed, and especially because the administration has so criticized the Obama administration for its Syria policy and drawing a chemical weapons red line and then not enforcing it with the use of force, something was going to happen. But I think more deeply, the administration, by going after Soleimani, wanted to make the fundamental point that this Iranian behavior that we have seen in Iraq and in the region, particularly since 2003, is not acceptable. We will no longer let Iran have a cutout between the masterminds in Tehran and the Iraqi or Yemeni or Lebanese or Syrian or Afghan or Pakistanis who are out doing Iran's work.
Right.
And the message to Tehran was, you are responsible for everything that your proxies do. Now, is that the right strategy? I don't know. But in my mind, that explains why the decision was made to go after such a senior and controversial target as Soleimani.
Can I
All right.
just
Yes, of
one
course.
sentence of
Yes,
explanation?
please.
I
By all
haven't
means.
opined as to whether or not it was wise or not
Right.
to go after Qasem Soleimani. My only objection is that it was
Done
only
in
stated
Iraq, yeah.
objection is that it was done in Iraq.
Yeah.
If his plane
I've-
had gone
yeah.
down over the Gulf,
Yeah.
I would have no beef in
I'd
that fight,
actually
no dog in that fight.
have agreed with you on Twitter that is really the biggest problem with this, is that it drags Iraq into a terrible situation. I'm going to take a batch of 3, okay, and so I'm going to go you, and then we'll come over here. We'll do a couple of batches of 3. So you, sir, you, madam, and then you. No, begin here, right here. First guy, yeah. And then
Hello.
we'll go there, and then you.
Paul Sutphin from CNR Resources. 2
Yes.
quick related questions.
1, please.
Okay.
There's just so many people.
Reports in the press about U.S. engagement with the Kurdistan Regional Government about a permanent base should the Parliament's non-binding resolution become implemented.
Yeah.
Lots of criticism of this. It's an issue that's been brought up before. Views on, is this something the administration is really taking possible, and
Okay.
could it possibly work?
There we go. Good question. the lady over here, and then the gentleman there, and then we'll switch back over to this side.
Hi, Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. How do you view the threat of sanctions from Trump? Do you take it seriously?
Sanctions?
Sanctions from
Trump.
Trump. Yeah.
From
Iraq?
Trump.
From Trump
On Iraq, do you take
Yeah.
it seriously?
Oh, on Iraq.
seriously.
Oh, okay. Good question. Okay. Okay, great. And then we have the gentleman here in the blue. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Absolutely.
Hi. A quick comment for Doug on your point on the economic nationalism of Iraq. You know, even with the protesters, their political message is quite legitimate. Their social message is inspiring. Their economic message is Venezuela. How do we, how do we try to fix that? Very quickly for Feisal, two points on the, and of course anyone else can comment, on the Hashid. It's one question.
Okay,
on the Hashid that we haven't discussed. One is, they seem to get, my observations being in Baghdad is just about the time that the Hashid have a legitimacy problem.
Yeah.
I detected it in April.
Oh, they do.
Daesh is done. Why are the Hashid still here?
Yeah.
And then the Israelis or someone else strikes their warehouse, and it's like, oh, well, if the West doesn't like the Hashid, they must have a valid point. And then they were really wearing out their welcome with their alleged, quite plausible role in the putting down of the protesters.
Right.
And then we strike KH sites, and all of a sudden they're on the front line of defending Iraq again. Are we going to continue to rescue their legitimacy time and time again?
That's a good question.
And then just on the career path, how do we talked about the legitimate
multiple
security forces having an issue with vis-a-vis the Hashid. How do they compete? If you join the Hashid, I can go be in a regular Hashid battalion, and then I can go over to Syria and fight with them, and then I can go back to Upper Karada and run drugs and girls, and then I can join the political organization. So those 2 points, how do you deal with the Hashid?
Excellent. Okay, great. Let's begin with the second point, which is how seriously do we take the Iraq sanctions, Trump's sort of sanctions on Iraq, and then we'll come to you guys for the other.
Okay, even though the United States has been issuing waivers for Iraq against Iran sanctions, at least when I left the U.S. government a year ago, Iraq had actually not taken any actions that violated U.S. sanctions. Which were much more limited at that point than they are now with the expansions that was announced by Pompeo and Mnuchin the week before last. So if Iraq actually looks carefully at what is sanctionable and what is not, it can avoid sanctions unless there are politicians in the government who wish to have sanctions imposed for political reasons and engage in those activities. Right. Second point on cutting off access to dollars, which is another sanctions issue. That is one I'm actually a little bit more worried about because the United States government is very concerned about Iran getting access to significant amounts of U.S. dollars, physical and electronic, through Iraq. And the Central Bank of Iraq has been cooperating very closely with the U.S. Treasury for a number of years to prevent that from happening. If that cooperation at the Iraqi Central Bank ends and it is easier to get dollars from Iraq into Iran, there will be a cutoff of access to Iraq of U.S. dollars. I have no doubt in it.
How about in 2015?
Yeah.
I mean, we did it once.
How about a permanent U.S. base in KRG?
I think at this point there's probably all sorts of options are being explored, including are there parts of the country, well, I also know there are no U.S. military bases except for the headquarters of the CJTF OIR, the counter-ISIS mission in the Green Zone in Baghdad. They are all in Anbar,
They are Iraqi bases.
Or no, they're Iraqi bases, but they're also in the north and the west of the country, away from Shia population, except in Baghdad. So the opportunity of people to attack huge Iraqi bases with a relatively small coalition presence is pretty small, and the accuracy of these rockets is not very good. So I think we are looking at a lot of different options. Can troops be reflagged? Can the NATO mission be expanded? Are there parts of the country where things can happen? Can this all be moved offshore?
Yeah.
Because most of the counter-ISIS operations conducted by coalition forces were done from the air, from platforms not launched inside Iraq. So there are a lot of options.
What can the KRG get away with?
But the reality is Iraqi politicians in the Kurdistan region, in Sunni areas, and frankly, urban, more liberal Shia who would like to see a not corrupted professional police, counterterrorism service, Army, Navy, and Air Force would rather have a coalition of Western countries training and assisting and mentoring their forces than having the problem that you just talked about the hashd and the going back and forth between security forces and mafia activity, which is what has happened, especially in the past year and a half.
So that segues perfectly into the questions that were put before you, Ambassador.
Well, allow me a moment to give a technical answer to the notion of U.S. basing its troops in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and that is that would have to be done only with the approval of the government in Baghdad constitutionally, because issues of foreign affairs and national defense policy are within the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government in Iraq. So if it were done outside of that framework, it would be unconstitutional under Iraqi law, under Iraq's constitution, and would tend to support a notion of the United States supporting the breakup of Iraq. And I don't think any U.S. administration wants to get involved in that. As to the Iraq is Venezuela, by the way, there's a reason why the Tahrir demonstrators want government jobs, and that's because they know one day they're going to have to retire, and there's not a Social Security or the only sort of social security system that there is in Iraq is for government employees. It's one of the failures of successive Iraqi, governments over several eras, is to create a true social security system and to have sort of private sector pensions. We don't have that in Iraq. So if you're not a government employee, you don't have a pension. So everybody wants to be a government employee so that one day they can retire.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Is it Winston Churchill who said the United States always does the right thing in the end after exhausting every other possibility? And we are in the exhausting every other possibility phase now. So we have to get through it and hope for the best. I think we do sort of throw a lifeline to the hashd every now and then. I have to say, that there's a word we haven't mentioned here, and I'm going to mention it, and it's the marja'iyya, the religious authority in Najaf, is supremely responsible for two things. One is the political system in Iraq. The post-2003 settlement in Iraq is fundamentally the religious authorities' vision for Iraq. And at some point, and from contacts I have, they're not saying it now, but the Tahrir demonstrators are very well aware of this. I was going to say at some point they're going to realize that, but they realize it, I think, already. They're just waiting right now during the life. What I'm told is that no one wants to raise this issue. Even Republicans in the United Kingdom, lowercase r Republicans, don't think the monarchy should be abolished while Queen Elizabeth II is alive. So the issue's not being raised now in Iraq while Queen Elizabeth is alive. But once we get into a transitional phase in the marja'iyya, maybe this will come about. It'll be an interesting dynamic to look for. And you're right, Doug, that there's a great deal of prestige. The second thing the marja'iyya did is that it gave the fatwa that led to the establishment of the... now, it very quickly tried to say, well, no, this isn't what we meant. We didn't mean create an independent force. We meant volunteer for the Iraqi army. But it was too late. By then, it was too late. They had already been formed. And what I had hoped for is that at some point the marja'iyya would say just that. The war against ISIL is over. Everybody go home. But instead, what we got was the formal, the legal, legalistic incorporation of the hashd into the Iraqi security forces. I don't think they're going to go anywhere, and not for a time. And of course, the advantage to being in the hashd, as you yourself pointed out, is that you can, on the one hand, you're getting a state salary, which means a state pension, and on the other, you're involved in dealing drugs, engaged in prostitution and gambling. And actually, what's happening in Baghdad now is that the hashd has divided the capital. It's like New York or Chicago in the early part of the 20th century up through the 50s. There is relative peace in Baghdad, but it isn't because of the state enforcing its, legitimate policing powers. It's because the Hasht has divided the city up like the old mafia dons. And so far, everyone knows you run your business in this part of the city and you don't interfere in that part of the city. How long that's going to last, I don't know. But it's a very artificial and precarious peace in the capital, in my view.
Okay, great. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take another 3 and see how far we get. So let's do you, and then we'll go to the back if we have any more time, okay? So we'll begin with the lady in black, and then right behind, and then lady here.
Thank you so much.
It's on.
Thank you. Given all, my name is Rita Husseini. Given
Hi.
all, hi. Thank you so much for this. Given all the parallels that have been drawn between what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Lebanon, why is it that we can't make an argument or a call as to what the outcome is going to be in Iraq when we've seen what it was in Lebanon? I mean, the cabinet has been formed. It's largely pro-Iran. Why can't we make that same
It's a good question.
argument? But sorry, just one really quick thing on this question is that, especially given the fact that you mentioned that Iran has a much a stronger stronghold in Iraq than it does in Lebanon.
I don't know. Okay, we'll see. Next question, you, sir, and then we'll go to the lady here, and then try to get to the back.
Thank you, Alexander Kravitz. Quick question for Randa. Could we be seeing the demise of the Tahrir or the tuk-tuk protesters? Because what you hear from people in the street in Baghdad is that they are essentially being picked off kind of one at a time.
Correct.
You know, I mean, one's killed here, one's killed there, and slowly but surely, you know, and then just quickly, I assume that, fact check, I assume that no diplomatic note has actually been received or sent from the foreign ministry to the U.S. on the issue of
I cannot verify that, but I have not heard of one. I can't say definitively, but I don't think there has been.
so the ability to do
That
nothing.
meeting only.
Yeah.
right,
Exemplify.
with Talib.
Yeah, just the one
Okay.
meeting, and that doesn't
That's it.
count.
Third question will be right here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szaflowska. I'm the Polish Assistant Defense Attaché here. And my question is about the NATO and US. So the US government, you know, there are talks with the NATO. Secretary General, NATO Secretary General says that NATO, he wants NATO to take bigger part in it. Do you think that, I understand the intention, US government's intention would be for NATO to take over most of the US activities except for some kinetic operations. But that's my guess. Do you think this, if NATO took more of the responsibilities, would it do the trick to ease the tensions as for foreign troops?
Okay,
in Iraq?
excellent question. All right, let's begin with Randa. Let's deal with the Iraq-Lebanon analogy, if any.
Yeah.
There are, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
I don't think we know the outcome in Lebanon at all.
No. Well, you don't know the outcome?
No. Well, yes, yeah, but it's not what we have now.
So
I do know the outcome.
It's okay. I think the main difference is between Lebanon and Iraq is the marja'iyya
Yeah.
and the role it can play specifically in intra-Shia dynamics and in denying Iran total control, over the system. It cannot, look, Iranian presence, influence over Iran is a fait accompli. We are not going to question that. There is 87-mile border. The Iranians have been working now on embedding themselves throughout, political and societal life of Iraq for a long time.
Yeah.
There are personal relations, there are historical relations between different institutions in Iran and Iraq. So Iran will always have an influence. The question is, can you constrain that influence? Can you put some boundaries around it and create room for Iraqis, over time to be able to negotiate that political space, depending on primarily Iraq's national interests. I think, and that's where the marja'iyya has been. I mean, at different times, the marja'iyya has stepped in, basically, and made some calls which were totally anti-Iran, basically wishes.
Yeah.
For example, the call on Adel Abdul Mahdi to resign. That was definitely anti-Iran wishes. So And recently we have seen the Marja'iyya also take its stance on the independence of the decision-making process, the importance of looking at Iraqi interest after the parliamentary vote, But there are limits also to how far the Marja'iyya can push, given its own mindset about the role it wants to play, and it's especially Grand Ayatollah Sistani about how he sees the Marja'iyya play, Definitely he doesn't want wilayat al-faqih, and there is always this, this fine line he wants to cross. So I think where we can see that happening, tomorrow's march is extremely important on so many levels, including this negotiation between the US and Iraq over troop presence. What I'm afraid of is that we are starting to see, a negotiation space with different options, For example, more and more voices are saying, even from within groups that have called for expelling, removal of US forces on the training and assistance mission, that maybe this is negotiable, this is something that we can sell. However, tomorrow's march, what I'm afraid of, and that's, I think, what Iran wants through the march, is to create a political reality where it even makes that kind of negotiation extremely costly, politically costly for the Iraqi parliamentarians, for the Iraqi politician. And then it shrinks that negotiation space and denies option for middle ground solution. It's not like we remove them all or we keep them all. There are definitely middle ground solution of we remove some, safe phasing, we keep some for training and assistance. I think tomorrow's march, at least from an Iranian perspective, is to even remove those middle ground options, create a new political reality. And that's what I'm afraid of. And that's why it's hard to predict where we're going to go next, what's going to be the future of the protest movement, because I think of partly this, but I agree with you. There has been definitely an active campaign of targeting not only the protest leaders, although it remains leaderless, but also targeting people who have been providing logistical support for the protests, targeting the people who have been providing food, who have been providing transportation. And this is a very smart campaign. It's not like a random campaign of let's put down the protest. This is a campaign that has been well strategized, well organized. It's being implemented to target at every level, to target the different layers that make the infrastructure that make the protest movement sustainable and resilient over a period of time. And that's where the fear. Can this protest movement become resilient? Can it adapt itself to the evolving circumstances and then develop the ability and the know-how to be able to sustain itself? I don't know.
Did you have
I don't know. I think I'm really scared for the future of the protest movement. I really, but that at the same time, we always focus on Baghdad. Remember, Basra is much harder to control than Baghdad. You have Najaf, you have Karbala, you have Misan, you have the Diqar, you have Nasiriyah. All of this, I think, even that, you might maybe bring it down in Baghdad and then, Basra happens and then Nasiriyah happens. It's going to be hard to totally, kill the movement, but it can be the intensity of the movement, its ability to grow can be limited. Can be limited.
If I could, I want to make 2 points. One is I absolutely agree with Randa about I've talked about the negative role, in my view, of the Marja'iyya, but it has had a positive role, which is that it has been a check on Iran's sort of maximalist hopes in Iraq, and it will continue to be so. Regardless of obviously at some point the Grand Ayatollah Sistani will die, but Najaf is very jealous of its prerogatives. That's historically true, and it will remain true in the future. And the Najaf sort of Najaf's rejection of Wilayat al-Faqih has their institutional reasons for that, and that will also continue. Having said that, I think we should be careful. Those who know Iraq's history, and if I may, I'm pushing back a little bit about we know how this is going to end up. If those who know Iraq's history will recall the Portsmouth Agreement in 1948, in which there were particularly leftists demonstrated against the Portsmouth Agreement as sort of reintroducing, whatever the reasons were, and the police went out, and about 300 protesters were killed. It's called al-Wathba in Iraqi history. And one of those who was killed, by the way, was the brother of one of the greatest Arab poets of the 20th century, al-Jawahiri. And he wrote an elegy for his brother, which is still memorized today by school children in Iraq. And in 1958, 10 years after those demonstrations, which occurred in 1948, and by the way, brought down the government of Saleh Jabr, and Nouri Said was foreign minister. 1958, 10 years later, one of the reasons for the coup that ended the monarchy was the response of the Iraqi government to the 1948 demonstrations and the killing of 300 people. Now, we've had 600 people killed, 22,000 people injured, and those are the official numbers. So I wouldn't presume to know how this is all going to play out.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Now, I'd like all of us, beginning with Doug, to address the last question. I really think this, unfortunately, I apologize to everybody we couldn't get to, but the last question is a really interesting one. Could a larger role for NATO help to change the dynamics? A larger role for NATO. Rather than the United States, change the dynamics and make things which are necessary more politically plausible, saleable in Iraq, et cetera, sustainable?
But the simple answer is no, and not necessarily because of Iraq, but because of NATO. You need unanimity in NATO at the NAC to get anything done. Since Turkey is a member of NATO, there is significant political objection in Baghdad and to some extent in Iraqi Kurdistan to Turkish participation, and they're already there at a pretty senior level in the NATO mission. It makes this more complicated. And as I said, the message of Iranian missiles at the Erbil base was really at NATO members and NATO members who are separately members of the coalition that your forces are at risk, which is politically difficult to sustain back home in capitals. I'm not worried about Poland. I'm worried about Germany. So the answer is I think NATO is not necessarily the best vehicle, but the idea that something that doesn't look as American as the current structure might be a better arrangement. Again, my advice to this administration is don't talk about this in public. Don't throw options out on the table in public. This is something best discussed with the Iraqi government, with the proper people in the government, and in Brussels at NATO and in bilateral discussions with our coalition partners on the roles that each of the countries would be willing to play and which countries believe that their national interests are still tied up in helping to stabilize and develop security forces in Iraq. I think a large number of the coalition partners still believe that the role is important. The events of the past 3 weeks may change the political calculations in capitals. I think the NATO mission should remain, but I think it will be hard to expand it significantly beyond what it's currently doing.
Okay. I'd like to ask both of our other two panelists for very brief final thoughts, beginning with Randa.
No, I think we need to start. We need to pay more attention to Iraq outside of the Iranian lens. Look at the media coverage pre-Soleimani kill of the protest movement and the media coverage in the West after Soleimani kill. Pre-Soleimani kill, we had hundreds of young Iraqis getting killed, thousands getting wounded, and some of us on Twitter were saying, where is the media here? I mean, there were some, of course, Iraqi-based, journalists, but it's nothing compared to what happened after the post-Soleimani kill, because that has been the problem, every time I've been to Iraq. The problem that Iraqis constantly say, not officials but others, is that we have not had recently an Iraq policy. We have had an Iran policy, and Iraq fits within that Iran policy.
Or doesn't fit.
Or it doesn't fit. And so I think the question of whether the protest can sustain itself, can become resilient, can adapt, I think we have an important role to play in keeping the spotlight shining on the protest. Individuals, the journalists, and not only in this capital but also throughout throughout the capitals. Where I think we are heading, I think we are heading toward a protracted stalemate of what we are seeing today. More young Iraqis will get killed. They are not going to be able to stop this protest movement totally. They can bring it down by a few notches, but they are not going to be able to kill it. It's going to continue, but at the same time, the government will no matter. It's similar to Lebanon. The government will. It's very similar. It's the government will never, be seen unless we have a total, really, the kind of government that the protesters want, which is a technocratic government that's independent of the political parties. Eventually, that can organize early elections where people, new faces, can compete and can win. I think this is not going to happen. Not in the short to the medium term. I think we're going to see more violence going forward, a more violent stalemate of the kind that we are seeing today, with more repression
and political paralysis.
Yes.
So very Lebanese. Ambassador Strabadi?
Well, let me just. By the way, I do want to go back for just one moment to Doug, and it's not just that there's no pension scheme. There's also not much of a private sector in Iraq.
Right.
I mean, in 16 years, we have failed to lay a foundation for a private sector in Iraq, and that's not going to happen overnight, by the way. I have to say, I think that we can all agree, I think Randa would agree, and I think that's the point of where you ended, is that this political class may be like the one in Lebanon, although I don't know, or much more about Iraq than I know about Lebanon, but the political class in Iraq is not going to go gentle into that good night. It's going to resist, and it is going to, already there's talk of a possibility that Adel Abdul Mahdi will be tapped again as the prime minister, and
Hariri will be back.
So I think that the governing class is not living in the same planet as the people of Iraq.
Exactly.
There's a science fiction story, and I can't think of what it is. It may be a Star Trek episode in which there's a planet governed by a class that lives in the clouds, and then the workers live on the surface of the planet. That's a damn good analogy for the Iraqi governing class. And they're all, frankly, listening to the president from Davos today was deeply disappointing. He talked about criminal elements that have been killing the protesters. These aren't criminal elements that are outside the law. These are people formally within the Iraqi security system. And where are the investigations that he and the prime minister promised the people of Iraq? I think the protests are going to continue. They may submerge for a time, but in 1948, as I said, a decision was made for the first time by the Communist Party in Iraq that it wasn't enough simply to change the political direction of the existing polity. It wasn't enough to kick the Brits out of Iraq. The monarchy had to go. That was the decision that the Communist Party, the Iraqi Communist. By the way, I usually wear the flag pin of the Iraq from the monarchy. So, but this is the historical fact. The Politburo of the Iraqi Communist Party took a decision in 1948 that it was now against the monarchy. Now, the protesters don't have that kind of a leadership structure. Maybe they'll develop one, or maybe entrepreneurial sort of, political figures will emerge. And I don't mean entrepreneurial in the corrupt sense of the word, but in the politically entrepreneurial. I started with Allah yarhamah, my late mentor, and I will end there. He had a tremendous faith. And his last book was on this. He published it in Arabic and in English. He had a tremendous faith in the young people in Iraq. And I think I do too. So, I haven't been terribly optimistic, but let me end on that note, that I would not dismiss the young because they understand. When they say Nuridu Watan, this has been translated as we want a country. A friend and, I guess, former colleague, Randa Rahim, who was the first representative here in Washington post-2003, has pointed out there's not a really good word in English for Watan. Yeah, she uses the, I guess, Latin or Italian patria. Patrie. And that's right. They want a place they belong to that's their own. and that's not for sale. And that's not a small ambition. And I don't think they're going to have that ambition scared out of them.
Okay, final words from Ambassador Silliman.
Very quickly, and I'm going to quote James Carville to Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid.
Yes, it is.
Despite all the political problems, despite the unruly Hashd or military, unless Iraq develops an economy and plugs its economy into the world, this is not going to get better. It's going to get worse as more and more millions of Iraqis grow up without opportunities. So strikes me we have another whole program to talk about at some point.
I think so.
soon.
And we'll be paying attention to Iraq all year, especially since we have Ambassador Silliman as our president. So we'll be coming back to this very important question again and again and again in the next 12 months. So thanks very much for joining us, and thanks to everybody online, and see you all next time. Thank you.